Anyway, you guys should be ready. So let's just do a really quick review of basic principles, and then I'm going to let you practice your speech. The goal is to speak for 7 minutes and to cover all the things you need to cover, right? Because all the pairs are going to go at the same time, just like the 1-minute debate, just like the other practices we did. Okay, so if you're the Prime Minister, the motion is this House would, what is it, replace the Prime Minister system in Japan with a directly elected president. Okay, right. So Prime Minister speech. If you're the Prime Minister, what's the first thing you should do? First thing the Prime Minister does. If you don't remember, you can look at the notes. It's written in several places. But if you do remember, that's better. Just say from your memory. First thing is walk to the front of the room. Second thing is look at the stopwatch. But aside from that, what's the first thing in the speech the Prime Minister should do? Say hello. Maybe. You don't have to say hello. You can just jump right into your speech. In fact, experienced debaters, usually they don't say anything like good morning or it's an honor to be here. They don't say that. They just jump right into the speech. But what's the first thing, first topic?
Introduction?
Okay, right. So if we're speaking in general in a speech, it should start out with an introduction. And for the Prime Minister, how does that introduction work? What should you talk about? What kind of?
Well, first of all, they're talking about a theme.
Okay, so you could even that's possible, yeah. Really, these three things there are sort of three things that you do in your introduction, but the order can vary, right? It's not absolutely fixed. So you set a theme. Okay, what else do you do?
Define the motion.
Okay, good. A definition. That's another one. And one other thing that you should do. Theme, stance, something like that, right? What else? There's one more. It's the one that usually comes first, actually, but it doesn't have to come first.
No, main points.
No, the main points is sort of, that's moving into, that's the second big step, right? That's the signposting. So, third thing. Background, of course. Like, what's the background of this topic? So you give some background. That usually comes first, actually. Like a typical way to start a speech is, today in Japan, we're experiencing a very difficult time, etc., 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 like that. Like background. Usually the background will involve some sort of problem. Right? If we don't have a problem, why are we trying to change anything? So background or the problem, and then the theme or the stance, and then specific definition of what you define the motion as. So these can come in any order. Sometimes it's the most common is probably 1, 2, 3 in the reverse order that you guys gave them to me. But it could be in any order. So you could start with your theme, right? You could say, ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, the government stands for a more dynamic Japan that is able to resume its place as the leading nation of the world. That could be your theme, right? And then you can talk about background, and then you can give your definition. So any order. You also should probably say the motion at some time, right? The motion is and our definition is. So okay, anyway, that's the introduction. Then signposting, right? So that's where you give your what? Somebody said it earlier. And I said, no, that's signposting.
Main point.
The main points, exactly. The main points, also called, what? What's another word for that? Found it? Well, now you're moving ahead to the next part. That's when you actually give the arguments. It's divided, right? First speaker, second speaker, so you call it a split, right? A split, right? So after you've given your background and your introduction and your stance and your definition, say, so we have 3 arguments today. The first one is, the second one is, the third one. Or we have 3 main points. You don't have to say arguments. You don't have to say the word split. You can say we have 3 main points. Or we can have 3 reasons why we support this definition, or anything like that, right? Or you can have 2, you can have 4, sometimes 5 even, not more than 5. It'll get too confusing. Okay, then you go to your arguments, right? So you actually give the arguments. So if your split is like, I have the first 2 arguments, and my deputy, or my member has the 3rd argument, then you give number 1 and you give number 2, and you explain. Right? Argument 1, argument 2, and then finally, what's left? A conclusion, good. And sometimes that can be very simple. You can just summarize. That's one possibility. Or sometimes you can add to your summary and go back to your main theme and sort of remind people, or even give a final example or something like that. Okay, that's what Prime Minister says. So how about Leader of Opposition? In the Leader of Opposition, what goes in the Leader of Opposition's introduction?
Analyze context.
Okay, right. So you talk about all these things the Prime Minister said, and you sort of analyze. Do you agree or disagree with the way the Prime Minister described the background or the problem? Is there even a problem, do you think? And then what's your stance? Analyze the PM's background. And then, second thing, your own stance, like your stance or your theme. Okay, good. That's your introduction usually. Again, these can go in any order. You can give your stance or your theme first, right? Opposition leader, you can start out and say, ladies and gentlemen, we believe today that Japan is actually doing fine. Compared to 99% of the world, we live well. Why should we change that? Something like that, right? Okay, anyway, so you move on from there then, you have your signposting, but in Leader of Opposition, you actually do this twice. Signposting, arguments, signposting, arguments. Why do you do it twice? Because your rebuttal, right?
Right.
And then what they call constructive, your own argument. So first, in your rebuttal, you signpost. I have 2 rebuttals. One about point 1, 2 about point 2. And then make the rebuttals. And then you say, okay, now we also have some additional arguments to support our side in this debate. So you can signpost those. one, maybe you only have two. I'm doing for the first one and my deputy will do the second one, right? Or my member will do the second one. And make the arguments. And then finally your conclusion. So, one possibility actually, you could signpost. You could signpost your own arguments right here at the beginning as part of your introduction. And then you say, before I make those arguments, I'm going to rebut their team. And then you remind people. So now that I've finished my rebuttal, let me remind you, our arguments were first and second. I'll be arguing the first one, and then you make the argument. Okay? That's possible. Or you can just not signpost them until later. Or you could even reverse these. You can make your own arguments first and rebut the other team second. But this is the most common way to do it. You rebut first because the other, the judges just heard all that. They sort of wonder what you think about that. And then you do your own arguments second. Okay? So that's what you should be doing today. So if you prepared your speech, it should look sort of like this, right? You should have an introduction that covers these types of things. Leader of opposition always has to be a little more flexible. It's one of the hardest speeches in the debate. Because you don't know exactly what the government team is going to say. So you always have to be a little bit flexible. But anyway, you should have it pretty much prepared. You should have some introduction. You should have some idea of your own about the background, about the situation. So whatever the Prime Minister says, you should sort of be ready to respond. And then you should have your own arguments ready. Maybe you don't know exactly what they're going to say, but maybe you guessed also some of their arguments. You thought about some things you could say to answer them, right? So that's your body of your speech, your signposting and your arguments. And then your conclusion. Maybe you have a dramatic way of ending your speech if you thought of one. Okay? All right, are you ready? I'm ready. So everybody go to join your partner. Sit down next to your partner. Like everybody take one table somewhere. So point of information after 1 minute. You can raise your hand or you can stand up and say point of information, right? Let's just practice it all together. Everybody's sitting down, right? Okay, all together on the count of 3, we stand up, we raise our hand, and we say point of information. Ready? Get set, go. 1, 2, 3. Point of information. And then what can the answer be? Sorry. Sit down. One more time. Point of information. Point of information. What's the other answer? Yeah, sure. Okay. What's your point? Go ahead. What? All right. That's 2 possibilities. Yes. What? Okay. Or no. Sit down. No thanks. Okay. Something like that. All right. So if you want to, after 1 minute. And then at 6 minutes, I'll go like this. No more points of information, right? All right. Okay. Everybody sit down except every leader of opposition all sit down. Prime Minister all stand up. Get your notes. If you should have notes, right? Are you ready? If you get a confusing point of information, then just say, sorry, I don't understand your point. Say more about that in your speech. Right? You don't have to answer. If it's a confusing point, it's best to say why you're confused. My point of information, he was talking about the media. He said the media is so powerful and we always believe it. And I think his point was the president would have more power over the media. But that's the point I made. I say, but wouldn't it be worse? Like it would be worse if the president was a president because then the president would have more power over the media. So actually what you should say is, you're right, that's exactly my point. So thank you for supporting my argument. right? There is some bad points of information. I made one. But if it's a really confusing point, you just say, well, I don't understand the connection between like the president and the media that you're trying to make. So you say more about that in your next speech. That's a way you can answer. You don't have to answer directly. Okay, right, do you guys want to hear my speech? Or?
Yes, please.
I'll try, okay. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister today made an argument about an idealized future of Japan where every problem is solved very instantly and where the media and the people report only the truth and where any kind of worry about decision making is just instantly solved. We think that's overly idealistic. Anytime your country has a problem, like the Fukushima nuclear disaster, you always want to say, what could we do better? But what the Prime Minister ignores is the fact that every country has its own problems. If a country has a president, it can still have problems. Let's think right now, why is the world economy in such big trouble? Is it because of a Prime Minister's decision? No. Where did the financial crisis start? The United States. Who is it that let Lehman Brothers fail and let the whole world stock market plunge into a disaster? One man, George W. Bush, the president, not the prime minister. Is it true that a prime minister always makes decisions more slowly or more ineffectively than a president? No, totally not true. Presidents make just as bad decisions as prime minister. We don't really think the first argument from opposition makes sense, that a president would necessarily decide more quickly in the crisis. To continue my rebuttal, the Fukushima nuclear disaster was such a big problem because nobody guessed it would even happen. They had their plan. The plan was approved. They had a wall that they said would stop any tsunami. Even if the tsunami went in, they thought that their disaster systems would work. It didn't. Under those circumstances, no one really knew what was happening, and that was part of the problem. The Tokyo Electric Power Company lied to the prime minister. The inspectors couldn't go there because the radiation damage was so high. Nobody knew what to do. If there was a president, does that mean the decision would be made faster? No. The experts in charge, the disaster relief teams, those are the people responsible. It's not the person who's in charge of setting government policy. So the whole argument of the prime minister that decisions will be made faster just doesn't seem true to us. Now, what do we stand for in this debate? We as opposition believe that life here in Japan is pretty good. It's true, people keep complaining about the economy. It's true that there are problems, like young university graduates can't get employment easily. It's also true that maybe some of the regulations on power could be improved. But we don't necessarily think changing the system to a president would have any impact on those kinds of decisions. We think, in fact, there are certain advantages to the prime minister system and certain advantages to the Japanese way of life that would only exist with the prime minister system. What we want to defend in this debate is quality of our life over simply like quantity and efficiency. So basically the government stance is a president is better because the president is more efficient, because the president doesn't have to listen to his party members before he makes a decision, or her party members before she makes a decision. But we think, in fact, the idea of listening to party members is good. We think part of the idea of a prime minister is it represents the people actually better than a president represents the people. So we have three arguments in this debate. My first argument is going to be local representation and the impact of local representation under a prime minister system. My second argument is going to be the idea of cooperation with the Congress, with the Diet. My third argument, or our third argument, which will be given by my second speaker, is about the negatives of the presidential system, especially when it results in presidential campaigns being a big popularity contest rather than a serious discussion of issues. So, I'll go on to my first argument about local representation. Now, one reason why it seems that sometimes people criticize Japan is that there are a lot of small local projects that eat up a lot of money, right? That's true. Japan's budget deficit is like 200% of the GDP in Japan, which is one of the highest budget deficits in OECD. And people complain about little local projects like, building an extra computer lab on a school where there are only 3 students because it's in a small area, or building the famous bridge to nowhere, right? Connecting like an island where nobody lives, right? People complain about those projects. But we in opposition don't think that's such a bad thing. Like, if a country has a lot of money, which Japan does, it's still one of the richest countries in the world, it has one of the highest per capita incomes, why not spend that money on local projects? Why not make quality of life? If you look at countries like the United States or countries like China where people are earning lots and lots of money and the economy is going really fast, who gets the benefit of all that? In the United States, the gap between rich and poor has grown tremendously, right? It used to be like the average company executive earned maybe 100 times the average worker. Now it's more like 300 times. China, it has the world's largest number of billionaires. It also has the world's fastest growing economy, 10% a year. But it also has huge amounts of poverty. It has things like in the China earthquakes when schools fell down and killed kids because they were improperly built. Nobody did anything about it. The protesters who protested, they got arrested and taken away, right? We don't think pure growth or fast decision making like you have in a dictatorship is necessarily such a good thing. We think it's better if the representatives all come together and then they elect one of their number to be a prime minister, because then every local community has a voice in what's going on in the government. Okay, so what if they build a nice computer annex in a school where there aren't enough kids to really use it? But that means everybody in that community has access to those advantages. We think that's good. We like that system. We want to continue local representation. Second, I know I don't have a lot of time, but the idea of cooperation with Congress. Again, our arguments are mostly comparative. Government team is claiming that president is better than prime minister somehow. Now, we're not saying president is always worse, but we are saying that a president has just as many problems, because right now in the United States, there's a lot of clash between Barack Obama and the Congress. Like, Barack Obama passed a health plan law, but he had to delay most of the provisions. So now there's a challenge in the Supreme Court. The Congress is saying they won't give money to fund the health care law. There won't be money for drugs. The insurance companies have their voice. It's paralysis, because the president can be against the Congress. But if the president is one of Congress, elected by the Diet as prime minister, it's better cooperation. So true, sometimes it means the president has to listen to many voices before he makes a decision. But on the other hand, when he does make a decision, the Congress supports it, it can work better. So for local representation, for cooperation, and as my second speaker will talk about, because there's less of a cult of personality, we think prime minister is better than president, and we're proud to oppose this motion. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about arguments in this debate now. So let's see what we've got. I'll put my split up on the board. Are you guys, if you remember what it was? If you remember what it was, so opposition arguments and government arguments. Okay, what was my first argument? Okay, local representation. What was my second one? Okay, cooperation with the Diet. And what was the third one? Yeah, the disadvantages of president's like popularity or something like that. It wasn't really clear, right? Because the second speaker didn't give a speech. Also because I don't think my label was very clear, right? It's nice to have nice short signposts. It helps people remember. Something like this, it's a little complicated, right? I told you my speech wasn't going to be great. It was going to be not bad, but okay. Those are my three arguments. Different arguments, opposition speakers. Why is the prime minister better than the president? It was something like danger of media control was his argument, right?
Yes, media.
Yeah, okay.
Media's power.
Media's power, okay. I think probably it's somewhat related to this one that I had. Like if the president, right, everybody knows the president, right? Before the election, the president campaigns for a long time, and there's millions of dollars in the U.S., like $1 billion or something to be elected president. It's and it just becomes like a whole show. And so, yeah, is that it? Like the president's like sort of a star, and people don't think about things sometimes. It's more like the personality rather than the ideas. So okay, so similar, but maybe a little different too. What other ideas did you have? All you guys, opposition leaders, what are some other arguments you brought up? Anything different? I had a rebuttal argument also. My rebuttal was, actually Japan is not worse than any other country, right? Not worse than the US. So I think one argument you can have is sort of the status quo is okay, right? Is that what you guys said as leader of opposition? Okay, it's hard to change the Constitution. Okay, good. Anything else? So it's sort of similar to this one and this one. Okay. That's actually a nice label. Focus on character, not ideas. Okay, good. That's a different one. It's maybe a little related, but it's a little different, right? Only, it's unfair, right? Only famous. Just famous people can be president. Good. Good, okay, excellent. Okay, that's, yeah. It's sort of like this, but it's also different. Like avoid domination. It's sort of like this, but that's a good one, right? I'm gonna put it up here because I'm out of space. Like you can avoid domination. It's sort of like the media power argument that Masahiro had, I think. But again, it's a little bit different, right? It's not just the media, but the idea that one powerful person, it's easy to become like a dictator or president for life, right? That happens. Some countries, like you start as president, but then you like find excuses to stay in power, right? Like, who is it? Chavez, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, right, is one a good example, I think. Okay, yeah, good, okay. And who else was leader of opposition? Oh, too big power, so almost like this one. Too much power. Okay, yeah. Somewhat related to this, somewhat related to this, but it's more even closer to this, right? Too much power. Right. Maybe somewhat related to my idea of it's better to have local representation rather than one person just making all the decisions for the country also. Somewhat related, but a little different, right? So this shows you some of the possibilities for this team. Let's look at government arguments now, the arguments that prime ministers had. And we'll see if we can find some clashes in the debate also. So prime ministers, go ahead and tell us your arguments. I know that Takuya's main argument was efficient decisions. Right? And you had a second argument, but I forgot what it was. What was it? Okay. So the people's, I don't know if mind is exactly the right word, but yeah, okay, that's a good point, right? If they directly elect, it's more directly their thoughts, not just their represent. Okay, good. I should have rebutted that. I should have rebutted it more specifically by connecting it with my argument and saying, but the people's mind in a parliamentary system is actually better reflected by their local representatives, because one president can't really reflect everybody's ideas. I should have rebutted that more directly. My mistake. Okay, anyway, good. But it's a good argument. Okay, what else? Prime ministers. What other arguments did you have?
Having strong leadership.
Okay, so strong leader, efficient decisions. It's somewhat related, but maybe different. Okay, good. What else? Okay. Independent from Congress. Okay. Also somewhat related to this, right? But a little different. Okay, good. What else? Ah, okay, so it's somewhat like this, like no party influence. So it's somewhat related to that, like everybody's sort of equal, has equal voice with the president. There's not like no like force, no power of the party to force the president to do things. Okay, good. Okay, so it's sort of related to this, expresses the people's mind better, but it's a little different again. Like people accept the decisions. So it means people like cooperate more with the government. They don't resist the government, right? That's good. So it means like, I don't know if that's a big problem in Japan. Are there a lot of protests against the government? Not really, right? But in some countries, that could be really important. In some countries like for example, France, right? They have like protests and strikes and the workers go on strike, or maybe Russia, possibly, or something like that, right? Anyway, although I think in Russia, even though Putin is called the prime minister, he's directly elected, isn't he? I think he's more like a president. But anyway, in some countries, maybe if the people directly elect, it would reduce the amount of protesting against the decisions, so they would accept it more easily. That could be a good argument. Okay? Anything else? Yes. Okay. More stable? Why? Is it similar to this? People will accept it, or is it more like this, a stronger leader? It's somewhat similar. Okay, stable government. Okay, right. Okay, good. Anything else?
And the execution of the president's plans and policies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's exactly the same as this. The execution of the policy works more quickly and effectively. Good. Ah, okay. You mean from the people. So it's somewhat sort of like this. The people will accept the decisions, but it's even more different. It's like people will be more interested. Okay. If they can't directly elect, then maybe they don't care, right? But if they do, then that's a good argument. Okay, good. So we have like a nice set of like lots of arguments on both sides. Actually, in 7 minutes, even 14 minutes, 2 speeches. Sometimes it's hard to make all these arguments. That's why you sort of have to choose. You have to choose the most important ones. So for the government team, like this whole set of arguments, continuing up here, right? This is sort of one big set about decision making. You can label it with whatever you think is the best specific label, like stable government, or strong leadership, or efficient decisions, or independent decisions, or something like that. Those could all be different labels, but they're all sort of similar types of arguments, right? And then here we have sort of a set here related to like people's responses, right? So we could label that however we think is the most important label, like the people's will, or people's mind, or like increase people's participation, or something like that, right? And then this one's sort of a separate argument in a way. It's somewhat related, that it's the people instead of the party, but if we have a problem, like I think in Japan you do have a problem, right? Like Ichiro Ozawa Ichiro, like has too much power because he's like the party boss, or he's not even party boss anymore, but he used to be, right? So he had too much power even though he didn't really have any official job. So that was a problem in Japan, right? You can say, and part of Japan's problem is that there's too much unofficial government going on, right? That it's interfering with the work of the real government. So we have people like Ozawa making secret deals with business people and then influencing and buying favors, and if we have a president who's not a member of a party in the Diet, then the president won't have to listen to those people. And so that can reduce the amount of corruption and reduce the amount of secret decision making and so on. So this is like so that's how I would organize this government team. Like argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. You can even label them really briefly in your signposting. You can say, okay, we have 3 arguments. One is about decisions, second one is about the people, and third one is about the political parties. And that way it's nice, easy signposting in this case. How about opposition? How can we group these? Did anybody see arguments that are somewhat similar? I see a few that I think are somewhat similar. Like I drew a line here. What other ones can we group?
Avoid domination and local.
Okay, yeah, avoid domination and local representation. We can sort of group that one. Okay? And maybe even I could group like this. Well, I think that's a little different actually, the cooperation. That more relates to decision making actually. So this one, this one, this one, we can group those together. Right? And then maybe we can group popularity, the media. They're both sort of related to power. We could even group like all these three plus these two, right? Or these three. We could all group them into one big group if we wanted to. Or we could have them like in two groups. So like we could have one is like the power of the president, or it's better to have like more diversification of power, and then two, like a related argument about the personality cult or the president, like the idea of popularity. And then this could be sort of a third one, like related to decision making, and then this could be sort of a fourth one, I think, separate. Make sense? So 4 arguments on opposition, 3 arguments on government. That's sort of how to group them. In a reply speech, the final short speech, this is what you should be doing. You should be grouping things. Even if like the teams have all kinds of different arguments, you should group them. So we have to group them even further now, because we have 3 on this side, we have 4 on this side. We have to think in terms of clashes. Which arguments on this side clash with arguments on this side? How about this idea of strong leadership? Right. Strong leadership, good or bad, right? That's one issue in this debate. So clashes. Or key questions. Okay, what's another one? So we've got a clash about whether strong leadership is good or bad. What's another clash? Okay, so will people, so the effect on people's participation. Good or bad? Will people become more interested and more likely to accept and support their government, or will people just be sort of like thinking of the president as some kind of star and judging on personality, and only famous people can be presidents, and then the people don't really get any benefit in that sense? That could be. Any other clashes? I think there's another one that's sort of important. It relates to this, but also relates to this. So, decision making. Better or worse? Okay, makes sense? And then maybe there's sort of a fourth issue about the Constitution. These are the 3 main issues, I think. So the Constitution issue is very interesting. So that's sort of interesting. Like, practically speaking, is it really possible for Japan to switch from prime minister to president system? What do you think? Practically, can we do it? If we all decide in this room we want to switch to a president system, will it happen? What do you think? Yeah, no, I agree with you. No, it won't happen. So this points out something very interesting about debating. In the debating world, you can debate things that are impossible to happen in the real world. Sure, in the real world, this is a really big issue. if you decide to try and change the Constitution, no one will agree, right? I mean, some people will agree, but other people will disagree, so it will never happen. In the debating world, it's not quite as an important issue as whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, or a good thing or a bad thing. So it's okay to bring up points like this. They're not major clashes. In a reply speech, at the end of the debate, I might not even mention this one. I would rebut it, like if I were the second speaker on the government side, the member of government, I would come up and say, and they say it's hard to change the Constitution. That's true, but that's not the issue. If we decide it's the right thing to do, then we should do it. Even if it takes a long time, even if we have to persuade people, it takes 100 years to persuade people. Still, what we're debating here is not whether it's practical or whether we can do it now, but we're debating whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, right? So this is sort of a more minor issue, although it's a very good point from a practical point of view. That's also, I think, an advantage of debating. One thing that I've realized in debating is that I actually have much more sympathy with the leaders of my country, and every country, because it's not easy to be a leader of a country. Even if you have a good idea, right? Like, there are so many barriers to try and get something done. Like, do I blame former Prime Minister Kan for Fukushima? No, I really don't, actually. I really don't. I think the Japanese system, in some ways, is a problem. I think, actually, this idea about party influence is actually a really important issue, maybe. And in some ways, the whole idea of, well, in Japan, all the politics, it's supposed to be sort of quiet, right? Like, everybody makes a decision sort of, you talk with all the people, and you talk for a long time, and then you make a decision, and then once the decision's made, then you announce it, and then, But that can be a problem, right? Because if you represent everybody, like the power company has too much influence, and then the politicians from the local district who don't want to have to spend extra money on something and whatever, it can actually be a problem, maybe. But it's not. I don't blame the prime minister necessarily. I just blame sort of the whole system. And sometimes, right, you can't avoid a crisis. I think the really interesting question now, this is my personal opinion. I'm not saying this like as a debater. I'm just saying my personal opinion. I think the really interesting issue now in Japan is it possible to really go non-nuclear or not? As I said, like that's the biggest news in Japan too. Now that we know that there is a problem, now that we had it demonstrated to us by a crisis where, like lots of people were harmed and they lost their homes and they were damaged by radiation and so on. So what can we do next to make it work better? But I don't think, anyway, I really don't blame too much the people who were in charge, although yes, sure, they should have been more efficient. Yes, maybe Khan was too, worried about what his party would think. That's a good possibility. So, yeah, I don't know, that's my personal opinion anyway, but I don't really blame him. I don't think if there was a president, it would have been a lot better. It might have been a little better. But it depends on who the president is. George W. Bush in the United States was, to be honest, a terrible president. Like, the United States would be a stronger, wealthier, more fair country without George Bush. So he's a good example to use on the opposition side. It's like, no, presidents are not all good. A recent example. But there are other presidents. Like, actually, for some reason, the United States is responsible for two of the world's biggest financial crises. 1998, 2008 and continuing is George W. Bush's fault, plus not just his fault, of course. Like, you could also argue it's not totally his fault. But he's the one who just was like, oh, I don't know what we should do, I don't know what we should do. They bailed out one company, then they didn't bail out Lehman Brothers, then the market crashed, and he's like, well, what should we do about that? Maybe we should pass a stimulus plan. Eventually, they passed a stimulus plan, but only like 3 years later, like right before Bush was about to go out. It was a mess. It was a real mess. Obama's done a much better job, but it's also true that Obama faced a lot of resistance in the Congress, so he couldn't do a very efficient job either, even though he was president. Being president is not automatically a way that means you're going to be an efficient decision maker, even if you're a good president. Generally, I like Obama, but he's not perfect, and the presidential system isn't perfect. So, anyway, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. Personally, what do you guys think? Would Japan be better or not with a president? No matter which side you were in this debate. Anybody who has a strong opinion?
I do not have a strong opinion, but maybe if we had a prison system, the leader can stay longer and they can do something better.
Maybe accomplish more in the end.
I checked 18 prime ministers in 20 years.
Right, right.
So.
Yeah, ever since Koizumi, right? Nobody stayed more than a year, or almost a little bit more than a year. But yeah, oh, that's a good point. Did you make that, or were you prime minister or leader of opposition?
I was an affirmative,
so did you make that point? Oh, well, we should add that, like length of time. We talked. Oh, maybe stable government. Who mentioned stable government? Yeah, was that what you were thinking also, Chansu? Oh, okay. So I didn't even think of that point, but that's good. That's a really good point. Time. Just time, right? No, whether they're a good president or a bad president, it doesn't really matter because nobody makes decisions all by themselves. But once the decision's made, they need time to let it work. If you just change everything in the middle, then it's like you have something half done. I think that's a great argument. That's absolutely a great argument for government. That's a winning argument in some ways. I mean, there's no guaranteed winning argument, right? It's a difficult issue, difficult decision. But seriously, the one thing about debating, I really sympathize with political leaders. Like everybody complains, but how easy is it? Could any of us do a better job? Probably not, right? I think even to be a bad president or bad prime minister, it takes a lot of skill and talent. So. That's something to think about anyway. I think the people's participation issue is very important. Like, what will happen if we change the system? Will we be able to get people to participate more? Maybe. But I think in a way, like Japan, actually a president system could work in a country where all the people vote in the election. Yes? But in Japan, less than half the people vote. The president system could work in a country where all the people vote, but in Japan, less than half the people vote. Actually, in America, less than half the people vote also. So it's what you said isn't exactly true, but it's also sort of a good point. And the question of what gets people to participate more, I don't know, actually. I don't know the answer to that question either. Maybe mandatory voting. That's a popular motion in Japan, I understand. Because that is a popular motion. This house would make voting mandatory. So that's maybe one possible solution. Mandatory, required. If you don't vote, you get a punishment. Like you have to pay money, a fine, or maybe jail. I don't know. They shoot you. Did you vote? No. Dead. Solve that problem. No, not shoot you, and not put you in jail. Usually like there's a fine. Like in some countries like Germany, Australia, you pay maybe, I don't know, like $100 or 10,000 yen, something if you don't vote. Small fine. Maybe it's 20,000, I don't know. Anyway, so that there's an incentive. But in countries like that, like Australia, I don't know the exact numbers, but I had a student in my class from Germany who did a report on this once, and he gave some numbers. So I don't remember exact, but Australia, 98 or 99% or something like that vote. Germany, 97% vote. I think the Netherlands, 96 or 95. So anyway, it's all like above 95%, every country with a law like this. But then, do they also accept the government's decisions? Are they interested, or do they just go and vote for anybody? That's the question, right? I don't know again. It's a difficult question. Yeah. Anyway, it's very interesting to me. I think debating, you learn so much and it makes you really think hard. And yeah. There's no guarantee who's going to win this debate, right? We have good arguments on both sides. So that's the thing. It's a difficult question, but part of the fun is trying to sort of figure out what's the best line of argument, and then trying to figure out how can you explain. So the team that does better at organizing and explaining, that's the team that will win. Doesn't mean that they're right. They could be wrong even. But if you do better at organizing and explaining your points, you can win. And I think that's very important too for learning just in life, right? You need to explain things to people. Every job, everything you do, you need to explain things. And you need to persuade people, even if you're wrong. I want to spend a little bit more time in terms of doing this worksheet. And after we do this worksheet, we can come back here. Well, we sort of did this. We sort of organized like a split, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3 here, and so on. But maybe we can even come back to this motion and think a little bit more about what's the best way of organizing the split, the strongest stance, the strongest case, and so on. So last time, we did a little bit more work with definitions, right? We just got through number 1, I think. And in this motion about directly electing a president in Japan, replace, the prime minister system in Japan with a directly elected president. Okay, great. So in this motion, do you have to define a lot or a little bit for your definition? Do you have to define a lot of things, or do you have to only define a little bit? Only a little bit. Why? Oh, yeah, well, you can explain, but do you have to define, like the current Japanese system, the PM system in Japan? Do you have to define that? Not define, right? Maybe explain. Maybe that's good in your introduction where you give the background. Like, now under the current system, this is what we have. That's good because everybody understands. So you're right, actually. Even if you don't define, you sometimes should explain, and that's a good point. But do we really have to define it? No, right? Because it's very specific, right? This is a very specific motion. But if the motion was like this House believes presidents are better than prime ministers. How about now? Then we have to define a lot, right? Starting with what? What's the first thing we have to define in this motion?
Better?
First thing. This house. Who are we talking about? Better for what, right? Better for who? So you can define this house is Japan. And then what do you need to define? Presidents and prime ministers. And I think it's better to define that not one at a time, but to define it all as a group. This house is Japan, and we mean when we say presidents are better than prime ministers that Japan should replace the prime minister system with a directly elected president, right? Or something like that. Or we think that in Japan it would be better to have a directly elected president than have a prime minister under the current system where the prime minister is voted in by the winning party in the Diet and the emperor approves the choice, or something like that, right? So if this is the motion, you need to define it clearly. But this is very specific already. You don't really need a definition in this debate. Not much. Maybe you could define this if you wanted to, right? You don't even need to really, because it's pretty clear. But you could say, but by directly elected president, we mean that every 4 years the people vote and the winner of the most votes becomes the president for the next 4 years, right? Or something like that. Especially if you wanted to make this argument about the time. a long time. Maybe you should say something about this. For how long the president is.
Maybe who votes?
Sorry?
Who votes?
And who votes, maybe. All the people over 16 or something like that. Right, you could do a little bit of definition here. But it's not really very necessary. We can have a good debate without any specific definition because the motion is already specific. Right? So that's the thing about definition. You have to think, how specific is it? If it's already very specific, maybe you don't need any extra definition. And you just say, well, the motion is very clear. It means we want a president, just to define a little bit, we mean a president who is elected for 4 years without being able to be replaced. Instead of a prime minister who can be replaced anytime the Diet votes no confidence. So you could explain like that much, I think. Is that sort of what you did, Wenxin, in your speech? You explained about the system? Oh, okay. Maybe you spent too long in your introduction, if it was 6 minutes, right? Yeah. Yeah, that happens, right? There's so much to say that you spend a lot of time on one thing, and even in my speech, right? I spent too much time on my rebuttal and my first point, and then I didn't have enough time to really fully explain my second point about cooperation. Although I did okay. I mean, I got it done in like 7 minutes, and I had like 1 minute, from 6 minutes 15 to about 7:15, right? That's okay, but it's not ideal. Ideally, I should have been explaining that point at about 5 minutes, maybe. And then I should have had a better conclusion. I had to rush my conclusion, right? So anyway, yeah, okay, so anyway, that's like definitions. The purpose of definition, again, is to make the debate clear. But if the debate's already very clear because it's very specific, you don't need a very much definition, just a little bit. Let's look at motion 1B. Even though it's not relevant, maybe there's a stance and a definition, right? So it's irrelevant, and it's irrelevant because if you didn't get this last time, this is really important, so I'm going to bring it up again. Here's the motion. This House would set minimum quotas for women in Asian politics. What are the issues? Why are we debating this motion? What are the issues related to this motion? Not many countries have them, but I could say like, this House would set a minimum quota of guns for everybody, because not everybody has a gun. You have to have at least 3 guns in your house. It's a minimum. Yeah, but just because we don't have it doesn't mean it's good, right? What's the issue here? What do we want to have happen? It's about women's development, right? Women's development, that's an important issue. It's about maybe fairness. That's an important issue. It's about maybe gender roles. That's an important issue. Maybe it's also about tradition versus change. That's an important issue. Yes? So these are all important issues. This, women in Asian politics never have enough time to relax. So we propose, as our definition, a minimum quota of 3 movies per week for every female politician. Does it relate to women's development? 3 movies a week. No. Does it relate to fairness? No. Does it relate to gender roles? No. Does it relate to tradition versus change? No, I don't think so, right? It doesn't relate to any of these issues. So that's why it's irrelevant. Bad definition. This is just bad. This is really impossible to debate because it doesn't relate to any of these issues, right? But it does have a stance and a definition. Which part is the stance?
Women in Asian politics never have enough time to prepare.
Exactly. That's the stance. That's the why. And then what? So, 3 movies a week. We're going to force you to relax. If you don't go to 3 movies a week, then we're going to lock you in jail and make you watch movies by holding your eyes open. I don't know, something. Anyway, right? It's irrelevant. It's not something that you can really debate, but it has a stance, it has a definition. So the form is correct, but the idea is not correct. The idea is bad. So you can have all kinds of definitions, right? Here's one of my favorite examples. This is a squirrel, right? It's called a squirrel. A squirrel, it's irrelevant to the topic. Here's another one, just as an example of a squirrel. This maybe will be entertaining. Here is a motion that gets debated sometimes. It's an old issue. This house, what's S? Supports the death penalty. What's the death penalty?
Capital punishment.
Capital punishment, right? Killing people who commit crime of some kind. What are the issues? Motion. Issues. Okay? So, who can judge another person's life? Okay? What other issues? Cruelty. Good. What other issues? Respect of life. Mm-hmm. What else? Okay, crime rate. Good. What else? So, the accuracy or the fairness, right? Uh-huh. Maybe they're innocent. Anything else? Religion. Good. Okay, well that's a good list of issues. Okay, so here's my definition. Definition. The death penalty means killing cows and eating beef. So we support this. We support meat eating. What do you think? Is it a good definition? Killing cows, the death penalty, right? Obviously, this house equals all countries. And we think we should kill cows and eat meat. Our stance is because meat gives us pleasure, and pleasure is the most important thing in human life. It's irrelevant, right? It's not what the issues that we should be debating about are. So if the other team does this, then they're just trying to make a joke or they're trying to cheat by making it a different debate. I think you could debate this, right? Killing cows, but what are the issues for killing cows? Okay, food, okay, human survival, maybe food, nutrition, that could be an issue. What other issues? There's another big issue, right? Animal rights. Sorry?
Animal rights.
Yeah, animal rights. Do animals have rights? Do animals have feelings, etc., right? So that's a big issue. Maybe religion, maybe, sort of, because there are some religions that say you should not kill some animals or something like that. Like Hindus don't kill cows, right? But anyway, but the issues are different issues. So this is not relevant to this. It's irrelevant. It's a bad definition in this case. Okay, anyway, that's just sort of a fun example. Okay, let's just check them. How about C? Our definition is Asian democracies owe women equal representation. That's too general, right? Is there a stance? Well, actually, yes. The whole thing is a stance. It's not a definition at all. It's a stance. Equal, right? Equality, that's an issue. It's just an issue. It's not a definition, actually. It's just a stance, only. How about D? A values debate over general issues of whether quotas in politics are an appropriate way to advance women's status in Asia. We think they are. Is there a stance? Yeah, we think they are. They are appropriate. That's a stance, but it's a very general stance. It's not a very specific stance, but yes, it's a stance. Okay, how about the motion 2A? We define this House as members of the G20. We propose that the G20 immediately cancel any debts. For example, is there a stance? Any reason why? No, no stance there. No stance, no reason why. Just the definition. Right, so now part 3. Let's read the directions. Exercise 3. Go. Right. 2. Different good definitions. For the motion, this House believes space exploration is a waste. Then think of a good team stance that could explain each definition. Finally, add a background sentence or two. Okay? So you'll notice something. There's also a hint, but before I do that, you'll notice something that I have in order. I have like definition 1, and then what's the first thing I have under definition 1? What's the first word? Under definition 1. It says what? Background. I'll just say BG, background. Right? And then what's the second word I have? And then what's the third word? Stance. But in the directions, which one do I say first? First. No, first. Oh, let's read the directions again. Ready? Exercise 3, defining your own motions. Let's read. Ready, go. Right? 2 different good definitions of the motion. This House believes space exploration is a waste. Then, think of a good team stance that could explain each definition. Finally, add a background sentence or two. So, which one do I say first? Definition. And second? Stance. And third? Background. So, which way should you do it? Background first, second, third, or first, second, third? Which way do you think? What should you think of first? Maybe. And then second? Stance. And then third? Background. Okay, maybe. What if you did stance first? Is that okay? Yeah, that's okay too. It doesn't matter, right? The order actually doesn't matter. It's all related, right? It's all part of the general background. Like background, space exploration. What's going on now? What's the status quo with space exploration? Definition, specifically, what do we mean? And stance, why? It's all connected. So if you think of a stance first, like if you think of an issue first, and then a definition, and then background, that's okay. Or if you think about background first, and then you think definition, and then you think stance, that's okay too. It doesn't matter. Either way, anyway, actually. Okay, here's my hint then. Hint. Ready? Go. Break the motion into parts. How could this house be defined? And how about space exploration, right? So I think that will help you. So go ahead, again, with your partner. You can be talking together and thinking about it and then come up with some background definition stance. 2 different definitions. You have to have 2 different definitions. The background could be the same. That's okay. But if there's different background for the different definitions, then different background also is okay. All right? Okay, go ahead.